Good morning. Today is Tuesday, September 15th, and I thought I'd put up a video for the second week a little early. We are really in our second week, but there's always a lag time in the beginning of a semester. And speaking of lag time, I have a sense that some of you are taking this course because you want to learn about the U.S. Constitution, what it means in different contexts and how it's evolved over time. And some people do get turned off by going way back to early colonial era, the Revolutionary War, and then the drafting of our first Constitution, which is called the Articles of Confederation. I said, I'm learning about our Constitution. This is all sort of antiquated in the background. But like a lot of things, the background makes us understand what the context of the Constitution means. It's not an easily understood document. And I was just looking around because I usually carry one. Sometimes I actually carry one on my person, believe it or not, little U.S. Constitution booklet. And some of the aspects of our Constitution are understandable by reading it, but a lot of them are nuanced, and we have to understand what the intent was of our framers and our adopters, the people. What did they mean when they created these clauses in the Constitution? They are terms of art. They are terms to be interpreted. There are terms to be applied in different contextual fashions. And what could they possibly mean? And we argue about them to this day. So it's important to be able to look at the history of its formation in order to make a better argument about what it means. But I get it if you're looking at this material that I put up so far and thinking, why am I studying the Revolutionary War? I want to study about the U.S. Constitution. And in fact, after the U.S. Constitution was created, it wasn't what we have today. It was called the Articles of Confederation. But when we leave off that first module, what I want to do for the first week was talking about the philosophical philosophical roots that were not that much misaligned, if you will, with that of our sort of mother country, Mother England. What we felt was we weren't being treated equitably and applicably under that constitutional regime. We weren't being treated as free Englishmen should be. And the one thing that made us very different, though, was we liked local representation. That was a phenomenon that was really taking off here in the colonies. We created colonial assemblies, and they were representative of us from our communities. That wasn't really as much a British principle as it was a unique concept here in the colonies. Under British constitutional history, they had something called virtual representation. No matter where you were from within the British Empire, you represented the whole. American colonists, although very British, in fact, right up until the eve of the Revolutionary War, many were seeking reconciliation with Mother England because they identified as being very British. And so the changes that we really wanted was fair play under the British Constitution and maybe a tweaking of some of our understandings of how we should be treated under that. So that's the week one. I put up some readings for you. I might even put up a few more related more to to week one than week two. But week two is what happens post-revolution. We win, right? It's a little bit more complex than just that. What's really interesting to me is I think we probably shouldn't have won, but for the French. And maybe we shouldn't have won even with the French allied with us in terms of military might and skill and power and wealth. The British just didn't put their whole might into the capitulation of the colonies and revolt because they were fearful of being vulnerable back home in Europe, and they were just financially drained. And one thing that's never talked about, actually not very often talked about, as part of the peace process, Great Britain kept a great deal of holdings still in North America, the Canadian territories. And they also kept some Western territories, although illegally because they didn't get reparations. But we're not going to get into that. But they kept the Caribbean interest. That was a huge moneymaker for them. And so in terms of financial sort of settling of the dust, if you will, the British government recognized that peace was better than a continued long war, which they might have won if they really poured their heart into it. This is not a history class about the Revolutionary War. It's a history class about the Constitution. So we win. But prior to winning, in the First Continental Congress, in the Second Continental Congress, basically a group of revolutionaries getting together saying, what the hell are we going to do? The first one, basically, we're going to boycott British goods and we're going to really fight to repel them. We're not in full rebellion yet. But on the Second Continental Congress, that one is when the Declaration of Independence is written, and we do break away, and there's going to be a revolution. But in the First Continental Congress and in the Second Continental Congress, before we create a national government at the cessation of armed revolt with Great Britain, we actually start experimenting with government even then. And that's what the Constitution is. If you really want a thumbnail, what is a Constitution? It creates two sort of prongs. One prong is the framework of government, and the other is limitations on its powers coupled with protection of certain civil liberties for its citizens. So twofold. Limitations on government, that's the one most of us like to talk about, civil rights and liberties. But it's also just the framework of government. What are we going to have for government? How are we going to govern ourselves? Which is also a unique concept that America really differentiates itself from a Mother England, is that the power comes from the people, not from a sovereign king. The sovereignty rests in the people and rises up from the ground up. That is a novel concept in terms of modern history in that era, in the 1770s. Athens, Greece had it before, but it was on a very small scale and a very homogeneous people in a very small regional area. In fact, some of the European philosophers thought that a democracy, a republican form of democracy, could not survive over a large landmass because of the distant, compelling interests of different regions would never be able to gel and stay consistent without fragmentation and conflict. All right, so we get this Revolutionary War. We break away. Now we got to figure out what to do. And we know the initial breaking away is important because that's the Declaration of Independence. Although the initial breaking away was the Continental Congress actually wrote it up in July 2nd. This is Trivial Pursuit. But they wanted a formal written document, and they charged Thomas Jefferson and others. But everybody knows Thomas Jefferson probably took the helm and did most of the drafting of the document. But it's clearly based upon concepts in John Locke's philosophy: life, liberty, and the protection of personal property. But Thomas Jefferson changes it in more beautiful language, and it's life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And those of you that take this class live with me back in the old days when I was teaching at the Mount, I used to do a little moment where I'd say, why isn't it the attainment of happiness? And this goes to my dark personality, and that's because you can't really attain happiness. It's always fleeting, and so you're always chasing it. So that's why it's the pursuit of it, because it's a short-lived recipe that we only can have that at the table from time to time, and so it's a constant pursuit. That has nothing to do with the Constitution, but I think it's fascinating. But you do need to know what the Declaration of Independence is. It's not a legal document. It's not really part of the Constitution directly, but we can use it in an understanding of what the Constitution must mean. Because in the Declaration of Independence, it talks about that concept of having a social contract, if you will, between the people picking their government and the government being responsive to the people. And if the people are dissatisfied, they should be able to change that government. And so there's two prongs, if you will, in the Declaration of Independence. One is the political vision and philosophy of what America will be, and that is by the people, governed by the people, for the people, and power will emanate from them. And if they're dissatisfied, they have every right and power that are inalienable, basically God-given or naturally given, to control their destiny in terms of governance. And that's a very powerful statement. And so we're breaking away from England because one is we want that. We believe we deserve it. We believe it's God-given. And the second part is we're going to list a bunch of grievances. It starts off, all men are created equal. We talk about all these different concepts in it. It's a beautifully written document. I got to admit, my brother and I used to read it on the 4th of July before we lit off illegal fireworks. We used to read the Declaration of Independence, usually during a period of heavy intoxication. But I used to get into it and I'd read it, and it really is a beautifully written document. That first half about the political ideology of being free people, clearly it's what? Very hypocritical. Because when they were talking about freedom, they were talking about freedom for men, white men, and probably men of stature of a certain degree, probably property owners. Not that they weren't free if you weren't a property owner, but to participate in our democracy, that's who they meant. And there's no question about it. They did not include women, and they did not include slaves. Clearly didn't include slaves. Slaves weren't, never mind participating in civics. They were treated as property. And so when you say all men are created equal, it's hard to look at that document. It's hard to think of that history without seeing a glaring inconsistency with our motive. And that's the thing that's both sad, but also both beautiful in our constitutional history, is that the Constitution gives us abilities to fix things that are clearly wrong and mistakes that our forefathers and at some point our foremothers too, when they become involved in political behaviors, we recognize that. I hope we recognize that because we have such a beautiful ability to fix wrongs, our Constitution has a very special place within our honoring it. And, should we be ashamed and upset over certain things that have happened? Absolutely. But it's an aspirational document, right? We now more than ever, and we can go further with it, perhaps, but now more than ever, we are actually living by the words that were written back in 1776 on July 4th when Thomas Jefferson and others, but Thomas Jefferson ultimately crafted it. In fact, there's actually an original edited sort of rough draft of the Declaration of Independence. And one of the grievances that were listing against Great Britain wasn't just taxation without representation, denial of our jury trial rights, the discharging of our colonial assemblies. All those things are our grievances. Thomas Jefferson actually put a long grievance in there about how Great Britain has basically put the evils of slavery into the North American continent. But the irony of that is Thomas Jefferson owned slaves, and many of our other forefathers owned slaves. So to put it in a list of grievances is kind of like, it's like me grieving the fact that my daughter bought me a bunch of homemade cookies the other night. It's like, these are terrible, these are evil, but don't take them away. I'm going to keep them. But the Declaration of Independence is important. Why? Not just because it's a beautifully written document and shows our intent to break away from England, but it talks about our philosophical views about how government should behave and interrelate with the people. Why? At some point to come along, we're going to argue either in politics or in civics or in court or in some other forum what the heck we are as Americans and what our government should mean. We can look back to the Declaration of Independence and say this should help us interpret it. So that's why it's important in this next stage talking about the formation of government, because we've broken away from England, and the very first thing that did it was this political statement, but that still creates roots for our constitutional drafting, and that's the Declaration of Independence. Two-pronged document. One is political philosophy, the other is the list of grievances against them. And those of you that are into the suffragette movement, which we'll talk about a little bit in this class later on, the women's movement, which has been around since the dawn of time, but in terms of trying to create traction, they actually created a Declaration of Independence in, I think it's 1848 in Seneca Falls, New York, and they basically mock in some ways. And it says all men and women are created equal, and they talk about really the same philosophical views of governance, but it's to include all men and women. And in the list of grievances, as opposed to being against Great Britain, mostly list of grievances against men, basically treating women unfairly in civic life. I just find that interesting. But anyways, so we got the Declaration of Independence. We're in this post-civil Revolutionary War period. State governments, and this is the thing that's going to, I don't want to say really disillusion you, but states had the ability to go out and create micro-governments, micro meaning state level, right? But remember, the formation of our government initially wasn't the United States in terms of one monolithic country. The early inception of our nation after the Revolutionary War was really 13 countries that were working together in a certain degree of commonality, but keeping law, governance, policy local. And that's why it's called a confederacy. In fact, when you get to the Civil War, which we'll talk about a lot in this class, what did the Souths call themselves? The Confederacy. They wanted more states' rights, more power within the state. It creates complications. So we first break away. We really do have 13 independent states. And one of the things that's interesting, I'll get you a date for the Massachusetts right here. I'm going to look it up on my cell phone. Amazing technology, how it changes everything. I think it's roughly 10 years earlier than the Articles of than our own United States Constitution, the second one. Massachusetts Constitution. Of course, I can't see up close anymore, and I can't see far away because I'm getting old. Yeah, 1780. So our current U.S. Constitution was drafted in 1787 at Philadelphia, but the one prior to that was done in 1778 1778, I believe, or 1779, was drafted with the Second Continental Congress created the Articles of Confederation. I'm not going to throw it out as a complete piece of garbage, but it didn't work. But what happens initially is, so at the Continental Congress, they send all the states out and say, create Republican forms of government, and we'll use them. They didn't say this overtly, but this is kind of the goal. We'll use them as sort of a laboratory for seeing what works in a Republican form of democracy. And those of you that want to take a look, and I'll probably post it, is the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780. Pretty clearly looks, sounds, and is structured very much like the Constitution that we have for the United States of America that we created in 1787, ultimately ratified in 1789. So when we tell this mythical story of these great leaders going down to Philadelphia after basically 8 years of the Articles of Confederation starting to fall apart, we got to create a new Constitution. Everyone thinks they go down there with this like completely, blank slate of not knowing what to do. We got to come up with a new government. The Articles of Confederation aren't working. What could we possibly think of? We need these great, almost like, demagogue type characters to come in and come up with some new novel idea about how governance should occur. The states already gave us a pretty good roadmap to that, Massachusetts being one of them, as it always is. If you read the Massachusetts Constitution, actually, I think more beautifully written, talks about the arts and about promoting education. But in terms of the theme of, you're going to have a legislature, you're going to have an executive, you're going to have a judiciary, and seeing the checks and balances about veto and overriding veto and impeachment, all of those things are contained within the Massachusetts Constitution. And Massachusetts has a Bill of Rights. We call it the Declaration of Rights. They almost mirror word for word some of the Bill of Rights that we ultimately adopted in 1791. We took a 2-year break, basically, before we adopted the Bill of Rights. So anyways, we got to figure out what we're going to do. We create the Articles of Confederation. What is it? Most historians, most videos that I'm going to post, everything that you're going to probably read says it's this completely flawed system of government. Well, it's not so flawed. It gave us peace with Great Britain. We become a nation. It allows foreign nations to deal with us, give us loans, recognize us as a country that we're sovereign and they can't mess with us on some level. So it's not terrible in that sense. I mean, it's the birth of the United States, came under the Articles of Confederation. And again, it only lasts roughly 7 years, and what happens, it starts to fall apart because states are independent. It's really 13 different states, and like anything else, we're competing over money and control and access to ports. All kinds of different things are coming up, and foreign nations are starting to take advantage of that. So what happens? Articles of Confederation aren't working. Probably the biggest piece of evidence, I'll put up a little thing about Shays' Rebellion, happened right here in Massachusetts, was that a group of farmers weren't paid by the Continental Congress, and under the Articles of Confederation, they served in the war. They weren't paid, so they're deep in debt because they already gave up periods of time on their farmland out in Western Mass. They're heavily in debt. They're going bankrupt. And back in those days, you didn't just go to bankrupt and start over. You went to debtor's prison. So people were losing their farms and maybe losing their liberty. They're saying, well, wait a minute. We served our country. We're not getting paid. And the Continental Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, were helpless. They couldn't do anything about it. And so these guys rebelled physically. They would fight, shots fired. At first, they took over one of the courts in Western Mass. And it lasted for, I think over a year. It went on for quite some time. And ultimately, it ended when they went after the Springfield Armory, where Springfield Technical Community College is located, where I went to college, a place I still love and adore and very important to me. And the armory is still there, the museum for the Springfield Armory, where many weapons were made right up until I think through the First World War even. But they tried to take over the armory, which was then even an armory in the 1780s. And they almost pull it off, and makes people like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson and John Adams appalled. Like, federal government, come help us. The federal government says, well, we don't have an army. We don't have a military. We don't have any money. We're kind of just a piece of paper. We're just a basically loose affiliation of 13 states without any authority to tax, without any authority to regulate a commerce, without any regulatory power over tariffs between states and foreign nations. It becomes very apparent that we really don't have a central government at all. And there was a private military that had to be raised in Massachusetts to quash Shays' Rebellion. Shay actually survived it and lived, I think, in Vermont in exile for a while. Later, I think he's pardoned and forgiven. And kind of an American hero in a way, because not only did he fight in the Revolutionary War to break the yoke of Mother Country England off of us, but he raised a very clear specter that there wasn't clarity in the centralized government to fix major problems that had a national significance. What else was going on? Some states were about to go to war with other states over tariffs between the two states. Like if you had control of the port of New York, you're charging Connecticut and New Jersey an arm and a leg for goods that are going in and out because your port is the one that's most accessible for major shipping. It's a horror show, and all these states they're all printing their own money. Some states have. I don't know if I always think Rhode Island's doing something wacky, but I think Rhode Island was just had a printing press, like ripping off money all day long, and it didn't really have any backing of the government. The government's bankrupt. And some other states had what we call script or paper money that was fairly sound. Some are doing precious metal, and that's what some people demand, that, hey, I'll only take precious currency that's backed up by silver or gold. And it was creating an economic horror show. The nation is ripe for invasion, either again from Great Britain or even our old ally France. Other foreign nations as well see America as weak, and we're not able not only pay our own debts internally, we're not even able to pay foreign debts. So why would we get foreign loans? So the government's in big trouble. So we got the Articles of Confederation, works about 7 or 8 years, loose affiliation of states, and that's what the southern states did during the war with the North, the Union. There's some people that argue that that's one of the reasons why they lacked success, is because they didn't have centralized control of their own governmental entity or identity, if you will, during the Civil War. And they did pretty well, even as a loosely affiliated one, in terms of actually war and conflict. So we got the Articles of Confederation not doing, and everyone treats this as a revolution within a revolution. All the states are invited first to a meeting at Annapolis, Maryland, where the Naval Academy is. They say, come on down. We want to have a meeting. 5 states show up, but a couple of powerhouses show up in Virginia and New York. Hamilton from New York and James Madison show up to fix or figure out what we need to do with the Articles of Confederation. We've got a problem. The government isn't sound in its structure. 5 states show up, all 13 are invited. But it takes another year or 2 years, and they have the second meeting in 1787. And in 1787, they meet in Philadelphia. Again, all 13 states are invited. Rhode Island doesn't show up. Kind of picking on Rhode Island again. They're known throughout history to be a bit of a thorn in people's side. I kind of find them amusing. I like that. I'm thinking about moving to Rhode Island someday, if I can get a place by the beach, because I like the ocean coastline of Rhode Island. But it's just an interesting bit of history. So 12 of the colonists go down there, and I think most of us are taught they go down there, they recognize the flaws with the Constitution, and what are they going to do? We're just going to fix it, okay? And we're going to make suggestions. And a lot of people say, well, you know what? They did a lot more than that. They go down there and they create a revolution because they throw out the Articles of Confederation. They draft the Constitution that we have today without the Bill of Rights initially, but they draft the Constitution. And they all leave giving each other high fives. And the country's basically just had a coup. Basically these 50 or 60 men go down there and overthrow the nation. No, they don't. They're going to send it back. And that's the next week and the week after's chapters dealing with all of the arguments that were done down at Philadelphia of what our government should really be. And most videos that I'm going to post and most lectures that talk about it seem to suggest these guys come out of nowhere with this new novel idea of checks and balances, bicameral legislature, and all that stuff. It's not that unique. We had it in Massachusetts and many other states for 10 years or 7 years, 8 years, depending on the date you want to look at. So, it's not that novel. But looking just at that sort of timeline that I put the semester on, we're starting off a bit slow. I want you to do the readings. I want you to get familiarity with our origin as a country. But really next week, but you should do it earlier, because where's most of the test fodder going to come from? Most of the test fodder is going to come from the Philadelphia Convention, where they talk about the actual drafting of the Constitution. That's where they talk about it. And what else do I have to test you on? Something called the Federalist Papers, and there are something called the Anti-Federalist Papers as well. Because unlike most history books, and unlike the history that we're often taught in high school, these guys just didn't come down to Philadelphia in 1787, come up with a new Constitution. Hey, we're all happy. No, what they did was they came up with a proposal, and they recognized in order for us to buy in on a social contract, the people have to agree that this is what they want. So they send it back to the states. And I'm getting ahead of myself. This is really the lecture for chapter 3, weeks 3 and 4. What they want to do there is now send it back so the people, not the state governments, not governments, people, they'll actually have a special convention, and we'll have the broadest array from all the different counties in Massachusetts, for example, because I know a lot about the specific Massachusetts process, but it was true in every state. Every state, they wanted to bring eligible people, usually white males of age who owned a little bit of property, but still more diverse in electoral body than anywhere in the world, pretty much at that era. They're going to go and they're going to determine whether or not to adopt this Constitution and reject it. And if 9 of the states accept it, it's the law of the land, and you needed 9. But there is also the political aspect that there was a recognition you needed the major large states to adopt it, even if you hit 9 anyways, because you wanted kind of uniformity. Eventually, all 13 signed, including the last one, Rhode Island, signs it as well. I believe New Hampshire actually initially rejected it before they came back and ultimately adopted it. So that's where we stand. We're talking about, chapter 1 was week 1 was talking about the origins philosophically and about the underpinnings of British philosophical constitution, which we liked. We didn't like the fact that it wasn't written, that it wasn't clearly articulated in one contract. We didn't like the fact that we didn't feel like we participated in it or treated equitably under it. And we had a few new ideas about representation that made us a little bit more novel. And here we are. We're now down in Philadelphia. That's going to be the next lecture. I know these go a bit long. I know when I look at a YouTube video, if it's more than 6 minutes, I start getting nauseous. Break it down. Hopefully you get something out of it. Maybe you don't like it. You can let me know too. Say, Corman, it would be nice if it was a lot shorter. Or Corman, I'm fine with it. It's interesting what you're saying. I do tend to do it a bit off the cuff. And, sometimes my dog will be walking through, my kid will be walking through. I can't go back and edit, but sometimes like the next one for the next week, which I might post in a couple days, might be, I looked at that video again, and oh my God, I missed all kinds of stuff. But don't be afraid for you. Shoot me a text, shoot me an email. Goes, hey, Corman, how come you didn't talk about this at the early inception of our Constitution, in the underpinnings in the First Continental Congress or the second one? Reach out, talk, let's have a discussion. But for tests, like if you're like me, how do I do well in this class? Much of the first test is going to come from the Philadelphia Convention and from the adoption process in the states and the debates that went back and forth. And those are called Federalist Papers. So basically articles that were written under pseudonyms, fake names. Hamilton, John Jay, and James Madison were the main authors of these propaganda pieces, and they printed them on the paper, and they were wealthy people, so they can get the publishers behind them, and they printed them. And why do we think they're important? They help explain what the intent of the constitutional framework is. So if we're in court or we're in law and we're a politician or we're voting for a politician, and they're saying the Constitution means this, that, and the other thing, they should be able to impart, if it's nebulous or confusing, substantiate it based upon what the framers wrote in these propaganda pieces promoting the ultimate adoption. And look at what the Anti-Federalists say, telling us why we shouldn't adopt it because of things that they interpret in that document. It's just as important. And then that's going to be the third week's prompt on the discussion board is who is right in terms of forecasting about the meaning and the implications and the implementation of the Constitution. Were the Anti-Federalists' predictions about the future more accurate than the Federalists? I think there's a clear answer to that, but you don't get graded on your opinion. You get graded on whether or not you can talk about it intelligently because you've read these materials. Otherwise, again, don't be afraid to reach out, ask questions, and stay well. And hope to keep working with you. It does get a lot better, those of you who want to actually talk about the Constitution once we get into week 3 or 4.